The rain poured relentlessly, drumming against the sleek, black car parked outside an upscale restaurant. Inside, surrounded by soft candlelight and the murmur of polite conversation, a woman swirled the last of her wine, barely paying attention to the man seated across from her. She was used to luxury five-star dining, designer clothes, first-class flights. To her, the world was divided into those who could afford such a life and those who served them. And she made sure everyone knew exactly which side she was on. As she stepped outside, her heels clicked against the pavement, her expression twisting into irritation at the sight of the waiting taxi. She had requested her usual chauffeur, but a scheduling mix-up had left her with this battered old cab with a driver who, judging by his worn-out jacket and the faint scent of cheap cologne, clearly belonged to the other side of life. She sighed dramatically, clutching her expensive handbag closer. "Ugh, this is what I get," she muttered, barely acknowledging the driver as she slid into the back seat. "Just drive. And don't talk." The man adjusted the rearview mirror, his face calm, unreadable. His hands, rough and calloused, gripped the wheel with quiet confidence. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked, his voice even. She exhaled sharply, rattling off the name of an exclusive penthouse complex, making sure to emphasize it just in case he needed reminding of the difference between them. The car eased into traffic, moving smoothly despite its age. For the first few minutes, silence filled the space between them. Then, against her own instructions, she started talking not to him, but to her reflection in her phone screen as she live-streamed to her followers. "Can you believe this?" she scoffed, flipping the camera to show the interior of the taxi. "I swear, this is what happens when good help is impossible to find. This car? I feel like I'm in a time machine from the last century. And the driver." She laughed, making no attempt to lower her voice. "Well, let's just say, this is not the kind of service I'm used to." The driver said nothing. His face remained composed, his eyes steady on the road. But something flickered in his expression, something unreadable. As the city lights flickered past, she continued, oblivious to the weight of her words. "I mean, don't get me wrong. It's cute that people like him exist. Someone has to do these jobs, right?" She leaned back, sighing dramatically. "But honestly, if you don't make something of yourself by a certain age, maybe you're just not trying hard enough." The car slowed as they approached a red light. The driver turned slightly, his gaze meeting hers in the mirror for the first time. And in that moment, something shifted. It was the way he looked at her, not with anger, not with resentment, but with a quiet knowledge. Like he knew something she didn't. She frowned. "What?" He smiled just barely. "Nothing, ma'am." The light turned green, and the car rolled forward. She scoffed, shaking her head and returning to her phone, but an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. There was something about him, something unsettlingly calm. Like he was waiting for something. Or perhaps, like he already knew how this night was going to end. And he did. But she didn't. Not yet. The ride continued through the city's winding streets, the distant hum of traffic blending with the soft patter of rain against the windows. The woman, still engrossed in her phone, barely noticed when the driver took an unexpected turn. She was too busy responding to comments from her followers, many of whom found her rants amusing, while others called her out for being insensitive. But she didn't care. To her, the world was about winners and losers. She was a winner. And this man behind the wheel? He was just another faceless worker who existed to serve people like her. The cab weaved through a quieter part of town, where the gleaming skyscrapers gave way to smaller, older buildings. It wasn't the usual route, but she assumed it was just a shortcut. Still, something about the unfamiliar surroundings made her sit up. She glanced out the window, frowning. "Hey, where are we?" The driver remained composed, his hands steady on the wheel. "Just a different route, ma'am. There's construction on the main road." She rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath. Typical. Only I would get stuck with a driver who doesn't know the fastest way home. But as they drove deeper into the quieter streets, a creeping sense of unease settled over her. The luxury and excess of the city seemed far away now. The buildings here were older, some with peeling paint, others with signs of neglect. There were no luxury cars, no designer stores, just the remnants of a different life, one she had never had to experience. "Are you sure you know where you're going?" she asked, a sharper edge in her voice now. The driver finally met her gaze in the rearview mirror again. This time, there was something different in his expression. A knowing look, as if he was watching a story unfold exactly the way he expected. "I know these streets better than you think," he said simply. Something about the way he said it made her pause. She didn't like this. She didn't like not being in control. She straightened in her seat, gripping her designer purse a little tighter. "Listen, just take me home. Now." The driver gave a slow nod. "Of course, ma'am. But before we go too far, let me show you something. It won't take long." Her pulse quickened. "Show me something? Are you out of your mind?" "Just do your job and you might find it interesting," he interrupted, his tone calm, almost amused. The way he said it made her pause. For the first time that night, she really looked at him. There was something unnerving about his confidence, like he wasn't just some random taxi driver. Like he knew something she didn't. The car slowed to a stop outside a small, unassuming building. The neon sign above the entrance flickered weakly, half burnt out, but she could still make out the words, "Community Shelter and Outreach Center." She scoffed. "What is this? Some kind of charity case? I don't do handouts." The driver shut off the engine and turned around to face her. "I know," he said. "That's why you need to see this." She glared at him, her irritation growing. But before she could protest, the passenger door opened. A woman, wrapped in a thin coat and holding a small child close to her chest, stood just outside. Her eyes, tired yet kind, met the rich woman's gaze. "Oh," she whispered, startled. "I'm sorry. I thought," the driver spoke gently. "It's okay, Maria. We were just passing by." The woman hesitated before offering a small nod. She looked like she wanted to say something else, but instead, she turned and walked back toward the building, disappearing into the dimly lit entrance. The rich woman watched her go, something unfamiliar stirring inside her. She wanted to shake it off, to roll her eyes and dismiss it as nothing more than another unfortunate sob story. But she couldn't ignore the way the little girl had clung to her mother's coat, how small and fragile she looked. "Why are we here?" she demanded, her voice sharper than intended. The driver studied her for a moment before turning back to face the windshield. "Because this is where I grew up," he said. "And because not everyone gets the luxury of looking down on people from a penthouse." She blinked, caught off guard. He continued, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made her uncomfortable. "I used to sleep in that shelter as a kid. My mother worked 3 jobs just to keep us afloat. And the only reason I ever got out of here was because someone who had more than they needed chose to help instead of judge." She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time in a long time, she had nothing to say. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, tiny droplets sliding down the car windows. The city beyond still gleamed with its promises of wealth and status, but for the first time, it felt distant. Like a different world entirely. She had spent her whole life believing that success was about who you were born as, about working hard and knowing the right people. But here, in this quiet street in front of this worn-out building, she was forced to confront something she had never truly considered: how different life could be for someone who had started with nothing. And yet, here he was. Not broken, not bitter. Just watching her. Waiting to see if she understood. She swallowed hard, suddenly wanting the ride to be over. "Take me home," she said, but this time, her voice wasn't as firm as before. The driver nodded, shifting the car into gear. But as they pulled away from the shelter, she couldn't shake the feeling that, for the first time in her life, she was the one being judged. And the strangest part? She wasn't sure she liked what the verdict might be. The night wasn't over yet. And something told her this was only the beginning. The city lights shimmered in the distance as the taxi glided back onto the main road, but the atmosphere inside the car had changed. The woman no longer lounged in the back seat with the same air of detached superiority. She sat upright, arms crossed, staring out the window, yet unable to stop replaying the driver's words in her mind. The shelter. His childhood. The idea that someone who had once lived in a place like that was now sitting in front of her, driving her home. It didn't fit the narrative. She had always believed that people like him stayed in their place, that success was reserved for those who deserved it. And yet, there was something about the way he carried himself, something unsettlingly composed, as if he knew far more than he let on. She stole another glance at him through the rearview mirror. He wasn't just some ordinary cab driver. She was sure of it now. But before she could say anything, her phone buzzed. A message. Her brow furrowed. It was from her assistant, a frantic string of texts lighting up her screen. Where are you? Are you okay? Call me ASAP. She frowned, typing back quickly. What? I'm on my way home. What's the big deal? Her assistant's reply came almost instantly. I just saw something online. You need to see this. Check your socials now. Her stomach twisted with an odd sense of unease. She switched apps, pulling up her social media. And then she froze. Her livestream from earlier had gone viral. But not in the way she had intended. Instead of praise from her usual followers, the comments section was a firestorm of backlash. People were outraged. Screenshots of her mocking the taxi driver had spread like wildfire, accompanied by furious captions, "Out of touch." "Disgusting behavior." "Humiliating a working class man for clicks." Influencers, news outlets, even brands she partnered with, everyone was weighing in. Some were calling for boycotts. Others were demanding an apology. Her heart pounded as she scrolled frantically. The numbers were skyrocketing. Millions of views. Countless shares. Her name was trending for all the wrong reasons. This can't be happening, she whispered. The driver remained silent, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. But she knew he knew. Her voice cracked slightly as she looked up at him, suspicion creeping in. You planned this, didn't you? He didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath, as if weighing his words. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he said, I didn't plan anything, ma'am. But I knew the truth would come out. She clenched her jaw. What is that supposed to mean? He finally met her eyes in the mirror, his expression unreadable. You made sure the world saw exactly who you are tonight. You just didn't expect them to care. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just a PR disaster. This was something worse, something personal. Her phone buzzed again, another message from her assistant. You need to fix this. Call me now. Her mind raced. Damage control. Spin the story. Play the victim. Maybe she could claim it was taken out of context, that she was joking, that people were overreacting. Yes. That was it. She just needed to get ahead of it before it got worse. She opened her camera to record a response, angling it to capture just the right amount of concern in her expression. Hey, guys, she began, her voice softer now, carefully curated. I just wanted to come on here and clear up some misunderstandings. Tonight, a low chuckle interrupted her. Not loud. Not mocking. Just knowing. She glanced up sharply. The driver was shaking his head slightly, eyes still on the road. What's funny? She snapped. He exhaled through his nose. You really think you can talk your way out of this, don't you? She bristled.
That's not your concern.
His grip on the wheel tightened slightly.
You still don't get it. Get what?
She shot back, her patience snapping. He turned onto a quieter road, the city lights dimming around them.
That your words have consequences, he said. That people are tired of being looked down on. That sometimes, the tables turn. She scoffed. Spare me the lecture. What do you know about tables turning? For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face.
And then, with deliberate calm, he reached into his glove compartment.
Her breath caught.
But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a neatly folded newspaper.
He passed it to her without a word. Confused, she hesitated before unfolding it.
And then her blood ran cold. There, on the front page, was a photo of him.
Not as a taxi driver, but as something else entirely. A powerful figure. A businessman. A name she recognized instantly.
Her pulse roared in her ears.
No. This wasn't possible.
She looked up at him, her hands trembling slightly.
He gave her a small, knowing smile. Now you understand.
The car rolled to a stop in front of her building.
But suddenly, home didn't feel so safe anymore.
And for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one in control. The city's glow reflected off the rain-slicked pavement, but the woman barely noticed. Her hands trembled as she clutched the newspaper, her mind racing.
This had to be a mistake. A trick. A cruel joke. She looked at the man in the driver's seat, the same man she had mocked only an hour ago. But now, he wasn't just a nameless worker behind the wheel. He was someone with power. Influence. Someone who, by all logic, shouldn't have been here driving a taxi. Her throat went dry as she read the headline again.
The article spoke of a self-made billionaire who had built his empire from nothing, a man who had once lived in the very shelter they had stopped at. His name carried weight in the business world. Investors sought his approval. He was a philanthropist, known for funding programs that gave people second chances. And his face was the same one staring at her in the rearview mirror. She gasped, eyes darting back up to him. You own.
Yes, he said calmly, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. Her heart pounded.
His name had been in conversations she had overheard at high-profile events. She had seen articles about him but had never paid attention.
Now, she wished she had. But why are you driving a taxi?
She stammered, her voice unsteady. He smiled, the same calm, knowing smile he had worn all night.
To remind myself where I came from. To remember what it's like on the other side.
His gaze flicked to her in the mirror. And to see how people truly behave when they think no one is watching.
A chill ran down her spine.
The weight of her own actions crashed down on her.
The live stream. The mockery.
The way she had dismissed him without a second thought. He had been watching her the whole time, judging her, just as she had judged him. She swallowed hard.
I didn't know, she whispered, a weak defense even to her own ears.
His eyes darkened slightly, though his tone remained composed.
That's the problem, isn't it? People like you never know. You move through the world assuming you're above it all. That people like me exist only to serve you.
She flinched.
No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever dared. Her phone buzzed again. The backlash was growing worse by the second.
Her sponsors were pulling out.
Her brand was crumbling.
And now, sitting in front of the one man who could have helped her, she realized with a sinking feeling that she had burned that bridge before she even knew it existed. She inhaled sharply, desperation creeping in.
Listen, You don't need to apologize, he interrupted smoothly. Not to me, anyway.
Her stomach twisted.
Then what do I do?
she asked, for the first time in years, feeling truly lost. He studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he shifted the car into park. "That's up to you," he said. "But remember, money fades. Status crumbles. And when all of that is gone, all people will remember is how you treated them." The words struck her harder than she expected. She had always believed power was about wealth, connections, influence. But tonight, this man had more power than she ever would because he didn't need any of those things to command respect. She reached for the door handle, but hesitated. There was so much she wanted to say. So many questions left unanswered. But she knew this wasn't his lesson to teach anymore. It was hers to learn. Slowly, she stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting her like a wake-up call. She turned back, half expecting him to say something else, to give her some final words of wisdom. But he didn't. He just met her gaze with a quiet, knowing look before driving off into the night. As the taillights disappeared, she stood there, her reflection staring back at her in the glass doors of her penthouse. But for the first time, she didn't recognize the woman looking back. And for the first time in her life, she realized that who she was truly had nothing to do with what she owned. Her world had changed in a single night. The only question now was, what would she do with it?